Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through one narrow stretch of water. That is around 21 million barrels a day flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most economically important choke points on Earth. And now the United States has brought the A-10 Warthog into that fight. That alone should tell you this crisis may be entering a more serious phase, because the A-10 is not just another aircraft. It is one of the most recognizable attack planes in the American arsenal, a machine built for dangerous, close-range combat, designed to stay over the battlefield, track hard-to-hit targets, and hit them with brutal force. And now it is being pulled into one of the most sensitive waterways in the world. So the real question is simple. What kind of threat in Hormuz is serious enough to make the Warthog relevant again? Tonight on Redline Report, we break down why the A-10 suddenly matters in a modern Gulf conflict, how Iran has turned the Strait of Hormuz into a pressure point against the global economy, and why this may be a sign that the crisis is shifting from deterrence into something more active, more sustained, and more dangerous. If you're new to Redline Report, this is where we break down the biggest geopolitical flashpoints with hard facts, sharp analysis, and real strategic context. So subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications, because what happens in Hormuz does not stay in Hormuz. It can hit oil markets, shipping lanes, inflation, and global politics far beyond the Middle East. Now let's get into it. The most important point here is that the A-10 Warthog is no longer outside this crisis. It has entered the operational picture around the Strait of Hormuz, and that tells us something critical about the kind of threat the United States is preparing to handle. This is not a symbolic move. The A-10 is not the aircraft you send simply to make headlines. It is the kind of platform you use when you expect repeated threat-hunting missions, persistent presence, and close-range engagements against targets that are small, fast, and difficult to manage in a complicated environment. That matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another body of water. It is one of the few places in the world where a tactical military disruption can rapidly become a global economic event. Roughly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed worldwide passes through this corridor. That means when Hormuz is stable, the global economy barely notices it. But when it becomes dangerous, everything changes. Tanker traffic becomes more expensive. Insurance costs rise. Energy markets tighten. Governments start paying attention. Investors start reacting. Import-dependent economies in Asia and Europe start feeling pressure. Even if the disruption is limited, the fear of wider instability can move markets fast. That is why Iran has treated Hormuz as leverage for years. Tehran understands that it does not need to defeat the United States in a traditional naval battle to gain strategic influence in this waterway. It only needs to make the route feel dangerous enough that the rest of the world starts absorbing the cost. That is the genius and the danger of Iran's approach. It turns geography into pressure. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, crowded, and vital. That makes it perfect for asymmetric warfare. Iran cannot outmatch the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. It knows that. So instead of trying to win a conventional battle, it focuses on disruption. The goal is to make the strait unstable enough, risky enough, and expensive enough that commercial movement slows, outside powers feel pressure, and Iran gains leverage without needing conventional superiority. That is where tactics like fast attack boats, swarm operations, drones, coastal threats, and maritime harassment come into play. A few small aggressive craft in the right place can create outsized consequences. They do not need to destroy a large fleet. They do not need to permanently shut down the waterway. They only need to make the corridor feel unsafe. A tanker captain hesitates. An insurer raises premiums. A shipping company changes schedules. Traders start pricing in risk. That is how a relatively low-cost military tactic can create a high-cost economic effect. And that is why the arrival of the A-10 matters so much. At first glance, the A-10 Warthog may seem like a strange choice for a maritime crisis. This is a Cold War aircraft built to destroy tanks, support troops on the ground, and survive in ugly close-in combat. When people think about modern air power, they picture stealth fighters, long-range missiles, and advanced sensor fusion. The A-10 feels like an aircraft from another era. But battlefields do not care about image, they care about fit. And in this case, the A-10 fits the problem better than many people realize. The first reason is loiter time. The Warthog is built to stay near the fight. It can spend long periods overhead, waiting, watching, and reacting. In a place like Hormuz, where threats can emerge suddenly from a crowded environment and timing matters as much as firepower, that is a major advantage. The second reason is close-range lethality. The A-10 was built to deliver punishment against dangerous targets at close distance. If the problem is not a large naval formation, but small, aggressive platforms that need to be stopped quickly, then heavy direct firepower becomes extremely valuable. The third reason is durability. The Warthog was designed to survive rough conditions. It was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to keep flying in messy environments. In a threat zone where risk can come from light air defenses, drones, or sudden close-range engagements, that still matters. And maybe most importantly, the A-10 is well-suited for a mission that is not about one dramatic strike, but about persistent suppression. That phrase matters. Because if Iran's strategy in Hormuz is built around repeated harassment, then the U.S. response cannot be based only on occasional displays of power. It has to be built around continuous pressure. It has to make those harassment tactics harder to execute, riskier to sustain, and less credible over time. That is where the A-10 can start changing the equation. A fast attack boat is only useful if it can appear, threaten, disrupt, and survive long enough to keep the cycle going. But when an aircraft is overhead for extended periods, watching the same corridor, waiting for movement, and ready to engage, that rhythm begins to break down. The Iranian model depends on uncertainty. The U.S. model is trying to replace that uncertainty with constant pressure. That is not just a tactical shift, it is a strategic one. Iran's power in Hormuz has always depended on the credibility of disruption. Tehran does not need to dominate the waterway in a conventional sense. It only needs the rest of the world to believe that any crisis could spiral into something costly enough to justify caution. That is how it turns Hormuz into a weapon. But that kind of strategy only works if the threat remains believable. If the harassment tools start getting hunted, intercepted, and worn down on a regular basis, the image of control weakens. The fear factor starts to erode. The strait still matters, but Iran's leverage over it becomes harder to maintain. That may be the deeper meaning of this deployment. The return of the A-10 suggests the United States is not viewing this as a brief flare-up. It suggests Washington believes the problem requires a platform specifically suited for sustained, low-altitude, close-range pressure against exactly the kind of asymmetric threats Iran prefers to use. That, in turn, raises the risk of escalation. Because once a confrontation moves from signaling into persistent operational suppression, the room for miscalculation grows. The more often U.S. aircraft engage Iranian-linked threats, the more likely it becomes that a wider military response follows. A mission that starts with protecting shipping lanes can expand outward into strikes on supporting infrastructure, drone launch sites, coastal missile positions, air defenses, and command networks. That does not automatically mean a full-scale regional war is inevitable, but it does mean this is no longer just a crisis of speeches and red lines. It is becoming a contest of ongoing military actions, and that kind of contest is far harder to control. That is one reason why markets pay so much attention to Hormuz. When people hear Strait of Hormuz, they do not just hear about warships and fighter jets. They hear about oil, shipping, energy security, and economic risk. And those concerns are not abstract. If this corridor becomes unstable, prices can move quickly. That affects transportation, logistics, manufacturing, and consumer costs around the world. A military clash in Hormuz does not need to be huge to have global consequences. It only needs to be serious enough to make the route feel unreliable. That is why even countries far from the Gulf cannot ignore what happens there. Europe cares because of energy and trade exposure. Asia cares because of import dependence. Financial markets care because energy shocks ripple across sectors. Even ordinary consumers can end up feeling the impact through fuel prices, airline costs, and inflation. So this is not just a military story. It is an economic one, too. And that is why the A-10's return is more than a detail. It is a sign that the United States sees the threat in Hormuz as active enough, persistent enough, and operationally serious enough to require a specialized response. That also tells us something about the larger strategic thinking on both sides. For the United States, this move suggests Washington is becoming more focused on mission-specific force employment. This is not just about showing strength. It is about selecting the right tool for the right threat. That indicates a more deliberate operational posture, one designed not just to deter Iran from a distance, but to actively reduce its ability to disrupt maritime movement over time. For Iran, the picture is more complicated. Tehran's approach in Hormuz has always been built around leverage, not dominance. It uses ambiguity, harassment, and repeated low-cost threats to create wider pressure. That has worked in the past because the waterway is so important and so sensitive. But the more its tactics are forced into repeated exposure under sustained surveillance and pressure, the harder it becomes to preserve that leverage. In other words, the conflict in Hormuz is increasingly becoming a test of which strategy is more sustainable. Iran wants the world to believe it can keep this corridor unstable whenever it chooses. The United States wants to prove those threats can be tracked, pressured, and gradually reduced. Iran wants uncertainty to work in its favor. The U.S. wants persistence to wear that uncertainty down. That is the real competition now taking shape. And it is a revealing one. Because for years, the A-10 has often been discussed as an aircraft from the past, iconic, respected, but increasingly out of place in a world of stealth, automation, and long-range precision warfare. Yet here it is again, relevant not because the world moved backward, but because the battlefield produced a problem that still rewards the aircraft's strengths. That says something important about modern war. New technology matters. Advanced platforms matter, but they do not erase the value of older systems when the mission fits them. In some fights, persistence is more important than glamour. Endurance is more useful than speed alone, and rugged simplicity can beat elegant sophistication if the target set demands it. That seems to be part of what is happening here. The A-10 is not back because the Pentagon suddenly forgot about 21st century warfare. It is back because the Strait of Hormuz has become a place where sustained presence, hard close-range response, and repeated tactical pressure matter. That alone should make analysts pay attention. Because if this model proves effective, it suggests the United States may be settling into a longer campaign to prevent Iran from weaponizing Hormuz through constant disruption. And if that happens, the conflict may become less about one headline-grabbing showdown and more about a long grinding contest over who can impose costs more effectively. That kind of contest can go on for a while. Iran does not need victory in the traditional sense to claim relevance. It only needs enough disruption to keep the global system nervous. But the United States does not need one massive battle to counter that. It only needs to make Iran's tactics more expensive, less effective, and harder to repeat. The A-10 fits that mission well. So when people ask whether this aircraft can change the war, the better answer may be that it does not need to transform the war overnight. It only needs to help shift the rhythm. If the Warthog helps make harassment less sustainable, if it helps restore confidence in movement through the waterway, and if it helps reduce the psychological power of Iran's pressure campaign, then it is already doing something strategically meaningful. And that brings us to the bigger takeaway. The most important story here is not simply that the A-10 Warthog is flying near the Strait of Hormuz. The most important story is what that deployment signals about the crisis itself. It signals that Washington believes the threat there is real, active, and persistent. It signals that Iran's asymmetric tactics are serious enough to demand a tailored response. It signals that the fight over Hormuz is no longer just a matter of rhetoric, deterrence, or diplomatic warnings. And above all, it signals that one of the most important waterways on Earth is becoming the center of a more active contest over whether global energy flows can be protected from sustained disruption. That is why this moment matters. When nearly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through one narrow corridor, any military shift there carries global weight. But when the United States responds by bringing in the A-10 Warthog, a platform built for close-range hunting, endurance, and punishment, it sends a very clear message. America is preparing not just to watch this crisis, but to actively manage it. That should concern Tehran. And it should get the attention of anyone who thinks the Hormuz crisis is still only about threats and posturing. Because once the tools of disruption start getting hunted instead of merely warned, the nature of the confrontation begins to change. And that may be exactly what we are seeing now. So what do you think? Is the A-10 Warthog the right aircraft for this kind of mission? Or does its return prove that the Strait of Hormuz is becoming much more dangerous than many expected? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more sharp, fact-based coverage of the world's biggest geopolitical flashpoints, subscribe to Redline Report, like this video, and turn on notifications so you do not miss our next update. Because if the battle over Hormuz keeps escalating, the consequences will not stay in the Gulf. They will spread through oil markets, shipping lanes, and global politics far beyond this region.